All right, and welcome to week 2 of characteristics and identification of emotional and behavioral disorders. Hopefully you all had a very good first week and ready to dive into week 2, which is going to focus around some work around identification and thinking about how do we identify students with an emotional disturbance here in Nebraska, but also looking at it from a federal standpoint and thinking about the definition that we have in place for emotional disturbance or other terms, as you'll find out. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a reminder for our course learning objectives. Here are the ones that we have for our overall course. I won't read them, but we're going to focus in specifically on that second one, which thinking about analyzing the applicable laws, policies, principles, and evidence-based practices and theories that guide the identification process. Our weekly objectives for today, we're going to evaluate the current federal and state definitions of emotional disturbance and think about how those definitions impact our identification procedures. And hopefully what will come from that is you'll be able to recognize some of the difficulties that are just present in the whole process of identification for emotional behavioral disorders. And right away, you'll notice that we use different terms when we're thinking about students and their needs and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about that to start with. So as you'll read in the book, we're going to read chapter 2 this week. First of all, we notice that there's going to be quite a few different terms that are used, and I think that's a good place to start. Excuse me, from a federal standpoint, and also in Nebraska, we use the term emotional disturbance. But we'll also see behavioral disorders, we'll see emotionally impaired, behaviorally impaired, socially emotionally maladjusted, and kind of what you'll find probably mostly in like research and institutes of higher learning is the term emotional and behavioral disorders, or EBD. A lot of times, most likely, that's what I would refer to. I did a quick search, and as I said, Nebraska uses the term emotional disturbance. Kansas also does emotional disturbance, but when you go to Colorado, it's a serious emotional disability. And if you travel to Iowa, the term is behaviorally disordered. So right away, and again, you'll see in the book and the videos for this week, is we have a lot of kind of just a variety of ways that we kind of talk about emotional and behavioral disorders from a federal and state lens. So why are we worried about this? You'll notice on page 86 of the textbook, I think Kaufman and Landrum mentioned this pretty well, is like we have to start with this good definition because we know that we have children and youth who have disabilities that won't be addressed unless their problems are seen for what they are, which is disabilities. So recognizing that, I think, is our first step, and making sure that we are all on a common ground of why we maybe are going down this path of identification of an emotional disturbance, and then what does that mean for us in school. So I think that's a good thing to think about as we're talking about this kind of big overarching thing about identification. And we're actually going to spend a couple of weeks talking about identification because I think it is something that's really just kind of there that we have to address. So why is this hard? I think one, and they kind of talk about this in the book, is that when we think about defining EBD, it's a human social process. So I think about that as, we recognize that there's some human factors involved when we think about this. They talk about how the label is kind is according to kind of the cultural rules at the time. I like what they said is that, whatever behavior a culture's chosen authority figure, those authority figures designate as intolerable, that's kind of an emotional behavioral disorder. And hopefully what you'll notice is that when we think about emotional disturbance as a verification, it really is a subjective verification. It is going to be, there's going to be a lot of human factors when we think about, who is a student that should be verified for needing special education services in the emotional disturbance category and who is not. And it kind of just gets into just all the things that we do in school and how we do identify kids and so forth, which again, we're going to talk about over the next couple of weeks. So obviously there's some difficulties in defining, and our authors kind of talk about these, the things when we think about things such as, the complexities in actually the measures that we use, thinking about assessments, we're going to talk about MTSS or RTI. There's also just this range and variability of like what's normal behavior in certain contexts and how do those contexts impact our behavior. And then also just the expectations that we have in school, which I think is a really interesting conversation to have, especially now. And, what does that look like post-COVID in terms of our expectations of kids? We know that things aren't ever in a bubble. So we also have these ideas of relationships to other exceptionalities. So thinking about learning disorders and, the combination of academic difficulty and behavioral difficulty. We also know that a lot of times behavior is on again and off again. What we might see from students early on in their education at the elementary level can sometimes kind of fizzle out as they grow older, and that causes some difficulty in terms of defining. And then obviously, when we think about special education specifically, we have to talk about thinking about labels, and you're going to read a little bit about that in chapter 2. But I guess the biggest thing I think about with these difficulties is, again, it is going to kind of come down to kind of the people that are involved. And we know that a behavior could be considered, deviant or defiance or disrespectful, and all those different things that we have when we think about behavior and discipline. All those things could be considered those things in one situation, but maybe not in another situation because of just differences in people's expectations. So that obviously is a part that we have to kind of address as we think about how are we identifying students who need additional support, specifically through special education. So let's talk a little bit about actual definition of emotional disturbance. So Kaufman and Landrum talk about this in the book in chapter 2, of kind of starting with Bauer's definition from 1981, which is students exhibiting to a marked extent and over a period of time one of these things. So one or more of these things. So an inability to learn that can't be explained by other factors, intellectual, sensory, health factors, an inability to build or maintain satisfactory relationships with peers and teachers, inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal conditions, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and a tendency to develop physical symptoms, pains, or fears associated with personal or school problems. So this is kind of where some of the definition of the federal definition kind of started, was from Bauer's work in 1981. So as you think about this definition, there's some problems out of the gate, I think. So think about that definition and talk about reflect on, can we answer these questions? Like, what exactly is an inability to learn, right? So, is that inability to learn explained by those other factors that we talked about? What about mental health factors? Again, what is this, that inability to learn in terms of achievement? Like, where we think about that, how long is that achievement dip? Is it 1 year or 2 years? Or is it just academics? Or is it also social, emotional, and behavioral learning achievement? Those are all like things that we have to think about that really aren't addressed in the definition. What are satisfactory relationships? What is an inappropriate behavior? What are normal conditions? These are all like those subjective kind of terms that I think cause difficulty and challenges with educators in thinking about this. So when you have a second, pause this, or you can watch this whole video. But the first video that we're going to watch from Professor Landrum talks a little bit about these factors and how it can cause some challenges. So we have this Bowers definition, and then the Federal Department of Education created the definition of emotional disturbance based on Bowers, and then they added to it. And what a lot of researchers will talk about is that they added to it that didn't really help things. What they added didn't really help things, and in fact, it actually kind of made things worse. So you'll notice in the highlighted parts is this is the way that they added to that definition. So they added things such as a long time. Again, kind of thinking about what is a long time. And then the biggest thing that they added was this adversely affects a child's educational performance. And that's one of the big things when we think about verification for special education is there an adverse effect on their educational performance when we consider if they're in need of special education. The other piece, excuse me, that was added to the federal definition is this italics at the bottom that talks about that this term specifically includes schizophrenia, but it does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted. That's going to be a tricky one, and hopefully you'll read a little bit more about that in terms of the socially maladjusted and how that does not is not included in this federal definition of emotional disturbance. So what do you think? What do you think of these additions? Coffin and Landrum kind of talk about, ironically, the definition that is the additions to the definition from the federal definition actually is probably contributing to an underservice of students with emotional behavioral disorders, and that the definition might cause less students to actually be identified. And that's going to be an interesting conversation that we're going to have specifically next week, is this idea of disproportionality and thinking about disproportionality not only from an under service standpoint, but also an over-representation standpoint. So we're going to get into that next week. So now let's look at the Nebraska definition. I gave you the link here that you can find determining special education eligibility specific to the emotional disturbance. And it's also included in our resources. Take a look at that and notice how does the state definition compare to the federal definition. So on page 105, the authors start to talk about an emerging alternative definition. Again, take a look at that and consider what problems this emerging alternative definition could solve. The interesting thing I thought about when I was reading is, they reference it as an emerging alternative definition, but you'll notice that it was developed in the 1980s. So they reference this, but it's obviously not something that's been adopted since then, and it seems to have taken a long time for any type of change to happen in terms of the definition. So that kind of brings us to this idea of prevalence. So as mentioned, with the current definition, there could be students that are not being identified. And I thought that it was interesting that the authors talked about that nearly all children and youth at some point in some social context could be said to exhibit an emotional or behavioral disorder, regardless of how we define it. And that kind of lends itself to this idea that we might be underrepresenting or underservicing students who might actually have an emotional behavioral disorder. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree? And what are the problems that we're facing with identifying students with an emotional disturbance? Which kind of leads us to our assignment for this week. But there's also another video that are in your resources on part 2, which talks specifically about prevalence. So go ahead and watch that as well. So our assignment for this week is in your text, I believe on page 108. And again, I'm using the ebook version of this, so the page numbers might be a little bit different, but there are 3 case studies: Betsy, Roger, and Tom. And your goal or your assignment for this is to identify or determine if you believe, based on the information that you have, whether Betsy, Roger, or Tom should be identified with a student as a student with an emotional disturbance, based on the information, like I said, in the case study, and then also the federal definition of EBD. And in your reflection, basically, you're going to do a reflection, determination, and a reflection for each kid. And then in that reflection, evaluate the information that you have. Again, answer, would you determine if each student should be identified as a student with an emotional disturbance, and why or why not? And talk about a little bit about the information that led you to this determination, and then also think about what's the information that you might still need to appropriately make this identification. Note that this is a really brief description of each student. We are not going to be making identifications kind of in the real world based on just the information we have, but it just gets you thinking about some of the different factors that we have to think about. So for this assignment, again, couple paragraphs per kid. I'm thinking roughly, if you just put it all on one Google Doc or one document and submit it through Canva, it'll probably end up being a page or 2 total, or maybe a little bit more. But think about those case studies and kind of come up with what you think. The other assignment for this week is our discussion post. So in your discussion post, kind of evaluate the current issues with the federal and state definition of emotional behavioral disorder. What do you think? How does the definition impact the number of students who are verified and who are not verified with an emotional disturbance? Like we've done in the past, these discussion posts, the initial post is due Wednesday, and then respond to at least 2 classmates, which is due Sunday. So the case studies and reflection, and then the discussion posts are your 2 main assignments for this week. And then last, I want to kind of give you a little bit of a preview of our final assignment that we're going to have in this course. So basically, the objective of this final assignment is using the information learned in this course and the coaching knowledge and everything that we're going to talk about. Basically, you're going to revise these existing ideas into a new form, developing a presentation to present to a staff. So what I'm going to do on the next slide is give you a scenario, if you will, and you're going to basically use that scenario to kind of develop this final presentation that you would provide to staff. I'm doing this now so that you can just start thinking about things. So as we've talked about identification this week and next week, what are some key points that when you're presenting to a staff you would want to include? And so now you can add to that slide deck throughout the course, so it's not overwhelming at the end. We're also going to let you submit some things during the course so that you can get a little bit of feedback and so forth. But that's kind of the plan for the final assignment. So here is the information provided. So you'll notice that a building principal is going to contacts you to see if you could support their building staff, as they've noticed that behaviors are getting out of control, quote unquote. So you are going to have this conversation with the principal. You notice that office referrals are an all-time high. Students are being sent out of class at an alarming rate. We also recognize this is a difficult time of year. You're talking to them, mid-spring, for both staff and students, and behavior data usually spikes around now, but it just seems worse. As you continue to talk, you ask some questions to get a better understanding, and you find out some of this data. that 22% of the student body actually receive special education services. 4% have an emotional disturbance verification. Of the students with emotional disturbances actually represent 16% of our office discipline referrals. And we have a pretty good amount of incidents of restraint and seclusion. So you can continue to read all this, but basically, again, you're going to be thinking about this information as you move forward and develop your kind of final presentation. As we get to the end of the course, basically, hopefully you'll have all the slides and information done in a format that you want. And then you're really the only thing that you'll need to do at the end is record that similar to what I'm doing right now and submit it through Canva. So we can continue to talk about this. Obviously, email me or anything like that if you have questions. So here's a little bit more guidance on that final assignment. We're going to make sure that we're including things such as the identification process and definitions, concepts, our characteristics of students with emotional and behavioral disorders, some possible causes and factors, our school-wide supports that we provide, and some ideas and alternatives to restraint and seclusion. And as I mentioned, it can be done in formats such as Google Slides, similar to my presentation now. You're going to add slides throughout the course, and then you'll record it and submit the final recording as an MP4 file. But we will continue to talk about that as we go along. For now, read chapter 2. We have 2 videos to watch, including, and then also this one. So 3 total videos to watch. The case studies are your main assignment for this week, and your discussion post due Wednesday. Respond to 2 classmates by Sunday, and that will be it for week 2. In week 3, we're going to talk a little bit more about identification and really digging into thinking about disproportionality and what that means specific to students with emotional disturbances. So with that, thank you so much. Hope you have a great week. Email me if you have any questions, and we will talk soon. Thanks.